Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. I'm joined today by three colleagues who are very aware of the preponderance of sports betting and gambling in general that impacts both our traditional students, our athletes, both personally as well as being berated by gamblers from the stands, and overall student mental health. Let me introduce them to you. My first guest is Jim Borchers. Jim is the president and CEO of the U.S. Council for Athletes' Health and the Chief Medical Officer of the Big Ten Conference. No small job. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Dr. Lindsey Mortenson is Executive Director and Chief Mental Health Officer at the University of Michigan's University Health and Counseling Center, and also a practicing college psychiatrist. Lindsey did author BASE's special series report that was funded by research and a consulting contract with DraftKings. She refused the honorarium. She discloses no commercial conflicts. And her attitude dovetails nicely with her closing skepticism about industry self-regulation. Lindsey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Karen.
And Sara Custer is editor-in-chief of Inside Higher Ed, where she writes the weekly editor's note column and analyzing the issues shaping higher education, including many facets of college athletics. Sara, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Karen. Really happy to be here.
Glad to have you. So let's start with the larger aperture beyond athletics. Sara, your column a few weeks ago on Brendan Sorsby argued that with the spotlight on him now, higher ed has an opening to raise gambling awareness for the entire student body. Brendan began betting in high school, which is absolutely stunning because the age is supposed to be at least 21, but that's not the story, and was using sports betting apps before he was even 21. Why do you think the campus conversation keeps getting framed as an athletics compliance story rather than a student health issue?
I mean, I think where a lot of the betting is happening right now is around athletics. So maybe that's just kind of where it's coalescing. And I think that's where a lot of the prediction markets are seeing a lot of action is on college sports. So perhaps that's why it's getting so much of a focus around athletics, because that's just kind of the natural place where students are placing bets. But scratch the surface and I don't know. I haven't spent much time on prediction markets, but you can kind of bet on anything. I mean, we've seen people in the Department of Defense betting on when the Venezuela issue was going to happen, or we've seen people betting on what Donald Trump is going to say in a speech, a televised speech. So it is strange that it's coalescing around athletics and then kind of being contained on just student athletes are doing this, whenever I think it's way more widespread than that.
It certainly seems that way. So, Lindsey, one of the things you've talked about is that college health centers for the entire student body routinely screen for alcohol, anxiety, and depression, but not for problem gambling. And you say many existing screeners are either too time-consuming or feel like relics of a land-based gambling era. First, what is a screener? And what would a screener actually built for a student with a betting app on their phone look like?
So a screening tool generally is going to be a questionnaire of some kind that is designed to find something in a large population, whatever it is that you're looking for. For a very long time in college health, there's been a focus on depression, understandably, I would say for the last 20 years. That's probably about how long we've been routinely screening for depression in primary care. That's been a primary focus, and alcohol misuse has been a big focus. My specialty is psychiatry, but Jim, who's probably practices in a primary care setting, can speak to the pressure in that setting on time and just how difficult it is to deploy all the screeners we would love to deploy in the medical setting or mental health or counseling setting, because people don't want to do tons of paperwork. And sometimes we end up screening them not for the reason that they're there. We've heard from students who will say, gosh, I came in to talk about my ankle and now you're asking me about depression. Like, please stop doing that. I think to screen for gambling issues in a digital environment is really interesting. It's an interesting opportunity. Ideally, you'd want to screen somebody sort of in situ, like in the place where they're doing the thing. And unfortunately, I don't think that's coming anytime soon inside the online gambling apps.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people who seem to be most invested in screening are public health and the healthcare industries and sometimes community health centers. But absolutely, a lot of the gambling screening tools talk about horse tracks and dog racing and lottery tickets and casinos. And those are still popular forms of gambling, but definitely not the most popular form of gambling in young people, which is the
Yeah,
population that I'm most concerned about.
no question. No question. So, Jim, USCAH, and you have argued for an accreditation system for athletic departments, a minimum standard, if you will, for health, safety, and well-being supports and structures. But athletic departments rely on money and are straddling the desire for revenues from gambling ads, gambling sponsorships across NCAA broadcast arenas, and even on scoreboards, and stadium naming rights, which distresses me to no end. Can mental health accreditation USCAH work while the money keeps surrounding the rest of the enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's a couple issues here. I think number one, we view accreditation as a self-study and a commitment to your colleagues and to your constituents as an opportunity to state that you are willing to engage in best practice and continue to look at your practices and what is going on, around them. And I think that's really, a cornerstone of what accreditation programs are. And I think athletes, when they in this environment are looking for holistically safe and healthy environments to perform their best, want to know what's going on around them. Now, look, from the gambling perspective, I think it is the largest mental health epidemic facing 18 to 24-year-old males today. That's how big of a problem this is. And it is not seen as a problem because the sites and the places that you have mentioned have ingrained themselves as part of the fabric of athletics. It's the way that young age group, young male adults especially, digest athletics. It's part of the experience for them. But that experience has pathology associated with it. And so if we just normalize it and say, well, yeah, of course, if you're going to watch a football game or a basketball game or whatever it is, and part of the experience of watching that is placing these $5 bets on what happens throughout the game, and there's nothing wrong with that, or that's normal behavior, we don't recognize the pathologic part of it, which is it can become addictive, it can lead to all sorts of issues, and it can cause all sorts of secondary mental health issues for athletes and, and what goes on around that process.
Yeah.
If we're not willing to be that direct and talk about it, then we should stop because we're not going to change anything. And so our perspective has been, we need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge what processes are in place. And for athletic departments, what resources are they giving athletes when confronted with this? Because we're not putting the genie back in the bottle. They will be confronted with it. And so how are we thinking with innovative solutions to make certain that athletes, if you're an athletic department, can address the issues that come along with gambling from a secondary standpoint, social bullying, the direct outreach, all of the things that happen around this for the athlete. Look, I think that people today view these gambling sites and applications as just like a video game, like kids used to play video games. And this is just a way for many of them to digest sport and become more engaged with it. But the secondary costs are significant.
I'll just anecdotally say I am so sick of seeing gambling ads all over TV and radio and everything else. Even if you do an app streaming on your iPad, you're getting inundated with. I won't listen to some stations now because all I get are gambling ads fed to me, and I find that abhorrent. So I do want to follow up on what you're saying. You're saying about what the athlete situation is right now, but because we're talking about biology. Lindsey, you described a trifecta of biological, social, and environmental risks, noting that the prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-control and decision-making, is among the last regions of the body to finish developing into the mid to late 20s. Tell us a little bit about that. Why is that?
Well, the why of biology is, a great mystery, to be honest. But, the newer parts of our brain, which generally sit kind of on the outside evolutionarily, are the ones that really define what it means to be human, and where we see the most heterogeneity, meaning like the most difference between individuals, which is why, one person can be exposed to gambling and not develop an addiction or gambling disorder, and another person may really struggle. Same goes for alcohol or nicotine, or opioids, or whatever the substance of abuse. So, but I mean, the science of this is so established, right, that it has dictated a lot of really good and thoughtful policies over the years that have taken time. But when you look at regulations for smoking, for seatbelts, for alcohol, right? There's a reason why there's a minimum drinking age, and there's a reason we require seatbelts, and there's a reason insurance premiums are higher for young boys. I have two of them.
Good
So
point. Good
it
point.
is, it's
Yeah.
biology, right? And so this is not contested, for fortunately contested science. And now that we know it, right, our policies and systems and programs really ought to reflect that knowledge, and we should develop systems that include some protections for people who are, you could say under 25. I agree with Jim on that 18 to 24 group really being, and of course under 18 as well, being the most
Yeah.
vulnerable. And
Yeah.
it's a choice not to, right? It's a choice to say, anything goes for people who are over 18, which is kind of where we are with the prediction markets now,
Yeah.
that you only have
Yeah.
to be 18 to participate in those markets.
And we're going to talk about those. But Sarah, I want to swing back to you. You've covered the higher ed landscape internationally as well in the United States for a long time. How much do you hear about gambling and regular students in the articles that you publish or the articles you've read or the people you talk to? How much do you hear about?
Not at all, actually, now that you mention it. We do a lot of coverage on mental health, and that tends to, well, I say not at all, not explicitly about gambling, but I think there's gambling in there. So we talk a lot about financial wellness and financial food scarcity and housing and a lot of the mental health issues that students are dealing with. And I think somewhere in there, gambling can contribute to all of those things. But the next step is never really made, kind of looking at the causes of what those are, or how institutions might consider gambling as a cause of some of these wellness issues that a lot of their students are dealing with. And then, it comes up when we talk about athletics. And for the most part, everyone seems to kind of agree that it's a bad thing. I don't know anybody who says, gosh, I'm so glad we've got that Bet Kings ad on the scoreboard. Maybe I'm not talking to the right people, but a lot of people kind of tend to agree that this is a bad thing. But there aren't any real solutions that I'm hearing about beyond what Jim has talked about with the accreditation and some of the recommendations that Lindsey has made. It doesn't seem like higher ed really has wrapped their mind around how to really grapple with this. And I think that also just kind of gets to the difficulty of gambling as an addiction, that it's really difficult to understand what the symptoms are, to identify what's going on with these individuals. And I think also for their peers on campus, do I know what my friend's gambling addiction even looks like? I could probably identify what an alcohol addiction looks like or a drug addiction looks like, but I wouldn't be able to know if my friend's addicted to gambling, or gambling so much that they're dangerously on the path of it becoming a lifelong problem for them. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to be done and a lot more serious conversations to be had.
One of the things that I did a few years ago with my master's class here at Penn is we were talking about gambling. And this, I think, was before COVID. So that tells you how long ago it was. And the apps were starting to materialize on phones. And I asked my students, I said, do any of you have gambling apps on your phone? And they said, no. I said, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I want you to pick a gambling app that you're interested in and download it on your phone. And I said, you don't have to keep it there for long. You can look through it if you want, but you don't have to keep it there for more than an hour if you don't want to. And then you're going to come back to class next week and tell me what you learned and were there any ancillary issues around downloading that app. Every student said they were tracked, marketed to, pitched, even if they've deleted it an hour into having it in the phone. The amount of data that's collected, Lindsey, this really strikes me as problematic because it never really leaves you off the hook unless you opt out, or somehow get a privacy policy that's better than the one we have.
Yeah, that's the sludge of the industry, right? So, in public health, we talk about these, beneficial nudges, right? Where we prompt people to do the things that are really good for them, right? Like go get screened for colon cancer or, go get your, A1C checked or something for diabetes. But the sludge is really refers to that like fierce resistance and stickiness of the apps that make it really hard to extricate yourself, even if you want to. So there's definitely a lack of like transparency, and there's like an opportunity for like digital literacy. Because none of us read the fine print when we sign up for these apps and download them, and me myself included. But the other issue that you allude to around data collection is what I wrote about in the op-ed is this dark data problem, which is any online sportsbook who says like we really care about our customers. I would just say, show me the data. You have more data than anybody does about
Yeah.
bettors at an individual level, bet level, financial data. It's a treasure trove for research and understanding and early identification of problem gambling. And we know that they don't intervene because, the bettors who kind of butter their bread, so to speak, are the problem gamblers who lose the most. So that's sort of going back to your original question about screening. That's why I'm deeply skeptical that you'll ever see a really thoughtful screener in a gambling app that then does what a good screener does, which is if you screen positive for a problem, you get appropriately referred
Yeah,
for treatment and help.
that makes total sense. So, Jim, as you travel around to the 18 campuses in the Big Ten, and we're not talking all in one state, as we all know, what are your observations when you spend time on those campuses with the head of athlete medicine, walking through the athlete medical facilities, talking with some of the athletic trainers? Do they ever comment to you about gambling or the prefrontal cortex or any of those kinds of things?
Well, I think what we hear mostly about is the secondary effects, the attacks on the athletes and the
Okay.
impact that has on their mental health and their ability to perform. I mean, look, this is a huge problem, and the widespread, accessibility through digitally native, young people to be, this is how they digest information. It's easy to say, turn off your phone, but this is how they interact. Right. And so they think that they just played a really good game. They think that they've done what the team has asked them to do, what the coach has asked them to do.
Yeah.
Yet they didn't meet some statistical level that allowed for a bet to be played. And so now they're being attacked on social media.
100%.
And now we're expecting an 18 to 24-year-old to have the maturity and the development to be able to deal with that. And they don't. Even in professional sports, they don't. And so that causes, as Lindsey and Sara will tell you, a lot of secondary issues. And it's not just around anxiety and stress, but affecting sleep and then, manifesting itself through other symptoms and then performance. And, we've seen obviously catastrophic issues with this where people are distraught and they don't know. And so that's why I say our mission is to say, I don't know that we can, for the athlete's sake, cut the problem off at the root. I think we've got to empower athletes with innovative resources to be able to say, if this is happening and it's happening to me, how do I immediately get access to someone who can give me some perspective and help and make certain that they've got the tools that they need to address it immediately? Because I think that's a huge issue, a secondary issue to all of
do too.
the gambling part of it is reality. And I think, we've heard, we go to, we're going to pass a law. We're going to do these things. These apps are still going to exist. People are still going to get to them. What are we going to give, for example, in my world, athletes access to avoid these secondary, problems that we see from gambling themselves? And then I think the reality around athletes engaging in this, I think we're just very, very naive if we don't think that if all your peers are doing this and it's normalized and this is seen as normal behavior, they don't view this as something illegal. They don't view it as something that is a problem. They don't view it as violating the integrity or the sanctity of what they're doing in their sport. They view it as, my friends sit around and watch a game and they're punching some buttons and they're having fun. I'm going to do the same things. And so I think that's, the thing that bothers me the most is, and I think Lindsey mentioned this, we're driving the responsibility to people that are not fully developed or mature enough to be able to accept or to be able to be expected to accept that responsibility.
Yeah.
You got to find the adults in the room and be better.
Well, speaking of adults in the room, I was quite surprised that a few years back, I think it was before Deion Sanders was hired, but I could be wrong. The University of Colorado football stadium accepted a naming sponsorship from either DraftKings or BetMGM, one of them. And the faculty went ballistic. They were like, well, what are we getting from that? Well, in exchange for sharing all of our emails on campus, we're getting X number of millions of dollars. And I thought, okay, what an answer that is. What a gold mine that is for that betting company to be able to access the ideal audience on a campus that cares deeply about football's progress. So sure, they'll take our money, but the pushback was strong enough that Colorado took that down and closed that partnership. I don't know if there are any legal complications, but since then, I've not become aware of any particular entity that has tried to name their stadium after DraftKings. We might have some of that in the pro space. I'm not 100% sure, but I haven't seen the kind of pushback on anything else. And I'm wondering, Lindsey, what do you think about that? I mean, is that a good sign, or is that just, okay, we did that, now we're done?
Well, I fear that there are going to be a lot more sort of insidious, smaller examples of that. And I think it was highlighted in a recent story run by the school paper at UCLA, where they described the efforts of one of the sports books to partner with certain fraternities on campus. And, in exchange for, putting a flyer or some kind of poster or something outside their fraternity house, I don't know what they expected in return or what they got in return, but I certainly have a lot of questions about that. Fraternities historically wouldn't be the most kind of financially hard up organizations on campus, but you can see how tempting an offer like that might be to a lot of student organizations or universities, colleges that are not so well funded.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely don't have the crystal ball, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were some stadiums that ended up named after sports books because of just how challenging the financial landscape is for the NCAA and for all these universities navigating, paying for play and things like that.
Yeah. Sara, I know you travel to a lot of national conferences with trustees and presidents and other senior leaders. You do a lot of different things around student success. And, these are the simple, non-political topics that all leaders need to be speaking about. Any of the conferences you've been so far ever address the issue of gambling?
Again, no, not in the sessions that I've been in. And I go to quite a few of these sessions. No, again, student wellness, yes, but very superficially, and certainly nothing about addiction on campus. If I can just offer a few points of clarification, though, Karen, previously, because I did cover this in a little bit of my research for the column I wrote a few months ago, that the University of Arizona is branded by the Casino del Sol, which is a casino in Tucson. Not quite a gambling app, but still kind of normalizing gambling.
Yes.
And then the example that Lindsey mentioned was Polymarket. Polymarket is going out to these fraternities. They did it across the UC campus system. They did it at ASU. It goes so much more than just pushing ads or notifications to students on mobile apps. They're going out to them. They're offering them free credits if they download the app, if they recruit so many people onto signups. They are sponsoring parties at their frat house. They're giving them merch if the kids allow Polymarket to come into one of their house meetings and talk to them for 15 minutes. Like, this is aggressive tactics to get these students, and they know exactly who their target market is, and they're not being shy about that. And I understand that institutions, their jurisdiction there is they can't do a lot whenever it's fraternities. I think they're kind of independent entities on campus, and there's not a lot that institutions can do there, but just being aware of it. And I don't know, maybe you send a counselor over there. Maybe you make sure that someone's checking in with those students. Maybe you, make sure that you have those conversations more explicitly with students on campus whenever they very clearly see a Polymarket banner sitting outside of a frat house.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. And that kind of marketing sounds exactly like every other group that wants to be on campus.
Mm-hmm.
I just heard something. I guess Philadelphia is the home of insomnia cookies. And I just saw an ad, I think either Facebook or Twitter, come on, sign on for free 6-pack of insomnia cookies. That is definitely designed to get them aware, even if they're not from Philly, that insomnia cookies, I think, are pretty good. The hope is that they'll keep you engaged and you'll come back. And I think that's the real challenge with this. Jim, did you observe any, or have you observed any of the Big Ten campuses that you'd like to say they're making some good progress, or they're starting to move in that direction that you'd like to share with us?
I think that I will say that athletic departments on Big Ten campuses are very aware of this as an issue because it affects performance and it affects performance of their athletes. And so anything that can affect performance gets attention. I would say that, look, I think that in general, resources are still scarce for most athletes or students when they are having an issue like this. I think they struggle at that age to identify that they're having an issue and reach out for help. I think we need to be empowering them with more confidential, private ways to ask questions where they don't feel like they're going to be in a spotlight or having their information shared. I think athletes themselves do have some recognition that this is a real problem and that it can be a real problem. But look, I go back to, this is to me no different than the opioid epidemic or any of these things. The marketing strategies, the ability to, convince people that this behavior is not abnormal, that this is something that's reasonable. And once you're down the path, you've got them captured and it's something that unfortunately I think we're going to be picking up the pieces from this before we recognize as how much damage has actually been done.
Yeah.
I'm just, I'm not as optimistic as some that this is just, this is just a passing fancy and this is just going to kind of go the way of something else. I think this is a real problem. I think it is difficult to identify, as Sara said, when someone has a problem with this. I mean, how much money do they have to spend before they think they have a problem?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have to be stealing? Do they have to be? No, I would say that, this behavior has a way of kind of sneaking its way into people's normal everyday lives. And look, the phone's really accessible. It's right there, and there's not a lot of barriers to being able to, participate in this behavior.
Lindsey, I'm sure you saw, hopefully you had a chance. I know it's been a busy week for you. I sent you all an article from Bloomberg that talked about the New York Fed just recently researched for the people under 40, and obviously that's a larger group than college-age students, the core sports betting demographic. The share of who had at least 90 days late on credit cards payments rose 7.9% after legalization of gambling in their state, and auto loan delinquencies rose 5.6%. We imagine that many of those students are carrying tuition bills and loans already. When that gambling debt shows up in your office, does it show up as debt or something entirely? And I've heard entirely different. I've heard anecdotally that some students are using their student loans to gamble. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah. So you're identifying sort of one of the most common gambling related harms that brings people into treatment, which is financial losses. So I'm really glad to see more research about this, because I think the thing that gets anyone's attention about this issue, and whether it's a problem for themselves or a problem for somebody, they're in a relationship with, is going to be different. For some, it'll be, gosh, our relationship has been under more stress. For some, it'll be, look, our finances don't look good. Or for others, it'll be like an intentional issue. Like, gosh, I feel like you're distracted all the time, or, we can't even watch a game together anymore. So I'm really glad to see the data, because for some people still, finances are going to bring them into treatment and are going to be the real pain point for them. Interestingly, on our campus, I'm starting to see more gambling in different courses. I've been invited to speak at a few different classes, whether it's in the School of Kinesiology to speak to our athletic trainers or our sports management students, our data science class. I'm going to speak at a political science course on communications later this semester about sports betting. So I think I bring that up because I think approaching this topic through students' intellect is another really important opportunity to study it, to like let students nerd out about gambling. And this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this research conundrum we're in, where there's all this data, but we don't have access to it, because I'd love to unleash some of our brilliant minds on this topic and really get them engaged. But I think another educational opportunity is for our incoming students, especially the youngest ones. We do require certain courses for all students to take. There was some federal legislation in 1972, then 89 and 94 that led to students being required to take a course on alcohol misuse. And second, it hasn't been since 1994 that we've had legislation to really update that. And that legislation was really driven by what are some of the biggest threats to young students on college campuses, alcohol and sexual assault and sexual misconduct.
Right.
And I think we need to, think about the opportunity to educate students before they even come in. That's the most receptive they are to things that we send from the university, is before they matriculate, they're very receptive to some of these requirements. Why don't we require a course on mental health and that includes gambling, whether from the standpoint of financial literacy or digital literacy? It's a real missed opportunity. And it sort of gets to something both Sarah and Jim have talked about, which is that I'm really delighted by how much stigma has changed around mental health since I was in college.
Right.
And how much more easy it is to talk about it. But I do feel it can be a little bit superficial sometimes, right? Not everything is depression and anxiety. And often even just one layer down is the real reason, you asked earlier about this, biological, psychological, social elements, right? Sometimes the simplest question can really open up sort of the real reason someone is there, which is something I wrote about in that op-ed, which was a case of a gambling disorder just right underneath the surface of what I thought was more of an anxious depression. So I think we're in this interesting space too, because I agree with Jim that I'm a little worried that things will get worse before they get better, because I think there's just this gap in being able to even talk about gambling. Money and sex are two of the most stigmatized topics that are really hard to talk about. So I'm not surprised at all that it's just not coming up, because it's hard to talk about and it's embarrassing. And it's, there's lots of good reasons that people are cautious about talking about those topics.
Yeah, because they know they might get in a lot of trouble one way or the other, that type of thing. Jim, you probably have the best view of anybody on this, of the kinds of harassment that athletes can take if they don't help the bettors meet their lines and win their money. Do you have any examples? You don't have to name names or institutions, of things that you have witnessed in that space, and what coaches are dealing with, what referees are dealing with, what bench players are dealing with, because they all hear it. This is particularly true in basketball, but they all hear this kind of abuse heaped on the athletes.
Well, yeah, I think the biggest thing I mentioned earlier is this idea that there's been these artificial expectations placed on these individuals, whoever it is. And you'll always hear something from the fans, right? I mean, in a game, in a stadium or whatever. But I think the ability to connect with people on social media, through digital means, to post things and to be able to say these things in real time, and that people have access to them. Look, I go back to the times when I played in the late 80s and early 90s. If people were upset with how you played, I mean, we didn't even have a cell phone. So they could yell at you, or if they saw you on the street, but it quickly kind of went away, right? There wasn't this, how do you actually you had to make a real effort to get to somebody if you really wanted to harass them.
True.
And so you might hear it going from the stadium to the bus, but and maybe, after a big game, you might have heard something, but it dissipated pretty quickly. And I played football at Ohio State, even when we lost to, Lindsey's school, which we did, we'd hear about it, but it wasn't to the fervor that you hear, even about that. And now you put on top of that, I lost money.
Yeah.
And I've been losing money. And that assault is real. It occurs. It's difficult to ask people that are digitally native, I think, to just shut that off and not communicate and not be so look, I know that even in professional sports, they've really struggled with, players that have said like, hey man, I don't know, you're telling me I'm playing well, but I'm getting killed on social media because I'm only averaging X points a game, or I didn't have that many tackles, or didn't do whatever. And the coaches are trying to say, well, listen to us. We're trying to win a game. And in order to win that game, we're asking you to do something that may be different than what this market is setting for this financial threshold. But trust me, win all the games you want. If somebody's losing money, they care about what that, what that bet is. And I think
that spread is.
those assaults are real, and they have real consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to wrap up with one other thing, because I don't want our audience to leave the podcast thinking this is just a men's sport issue. And somebody I know in the sports graphics space, Lev Apkiss, who does graphics for Sportico, did a graphic that started with me and has stuck with me. And it showed in the window, I think it was January and February of this year, or maybe it was the end of last year, in the number of sports, and one of them was listed was women's basketball, the number of times that gambling ads appeared in those spaces. And compared to earlier years, the men's sports had decidedly fewer gambling ads, which seems shocking. I don't even think that's possible. But the amount of gambling ads pouring into women's basketball in particular, both college and the WNBA, is growing exponentially. Sara, what are your thoughts about that? Is this equity in action here, or what is it?
You and I have talked about that, Karen, because I was pretty miffed by that, just considering the audience sizes for women's sports compared to men's sports. But I think you made a good point that these gambling companies recognize that they've got a fertile market there and that this is rising in popularity. So untapped users perhaps there is why they're doing that. To me, it speaks to a level of hypocrisy that we've kind of been dancing around here a little bit. The NCAA is made up of members who are colleges, and colleges are the ones who decide what ads are going to go on their stadiums and in their arenas. So on the one hand, you can't say gambling is bad and this is a mental health epidemic and our students are struggling financially and with depression because of their gambling problem. But then at the same time, have gambling apps advertised around your stadiums and normalized within the community. So I think this is what I'm saying whenever a higher education needs to maybe take a harder look at itself and the role that it might be having in normalizing this type of behavior. I think institutions have done a great job of really zeroing in on the mental health of their students. I think they've made excellent strides in that in the past few years. And as Lindsey said, the stigmatization around that has really fallen away. But the next step to that is to really connect gambling issues with the mental health. So it's kind of layering that on a little bit. They're already doing really good work around the mental health of students. Let's inject some of the awareness around gambling and the issues that can raise for students and educating them about the risks there.
And Lindsey and Jim, I'll leave the final question to you both. What, if any, training are schools doing for female athletes in this space? Have you heard of any? Or are they mostly focusing on the revenue producing sports? We know that Division 2 and 3 athletes are approached to gamble. They want to bet, and they're on their phone, or they'll give information to the equipment manager who will bet on his phone. How relevant do you think that is for having those kinds of people in the circle around men and women athletes and the larger building staff and that type of thing? I'll start with you, Lindsey.
Well, I was going to punt it to Jim just because you probably know the sort of athlete level, sport level specific information. But I'm glad you're asking the question, Karen, because I mean, actually, I hear the most about female tennis players because tennis is apparently a super popular sport for bettors because of all the micro opportunities for betting. So yeah, Jim, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, I would simply say this is a universal problem. It doesn't matter what the revenue is for your institution. It is equally problematic across Division 2, Division 3, NAIA, NJCAA schools. There's about 2,250 colleges, give or take, in the United States that sponsor varsity athletics. And I think all of them are dealing with this problem. And I think it's the same. I think all of these individuals are approached. All of them are dealing with this issue. And I think every institution has to own this as like I said, an epidemic amongst their student body and an epidemic for mental health issues in their athletics population and likely in their student population. Anything short of that is just, I think, as Sara said, is just kind of ignoring what the evidence is that's right in front of you.
Yeah.
And until we can do that, look, it's very similar to me in my world at like concussion. Until we can acknowledge what the problem is and talk about it and be honest about it, the solutions are going to just kind of not exist. We're turning our head the other way because it's hard work.
It
It's
is.
really hard work. And it's not, and I, with all deference to the people that say this is not a governmental issue. It's not, we're going to make this against the law. We need Congress to step in and change the law. We need to do this with prop bets these things, as we've seen, get litigated. Like, we've got to take some ownership of it.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge it. And then we have to, offer solutions. Is that going to solve everything? I don't know that it's going to solve everything. It's going to be a much better step than I think where we're at right now. And we've, as clinicians and as other folks here that are writing about this, need to hold ourselves accountable and need to hold, our institutions accountable to the responsibilities that, that we have around this issue.
Yeah, cannot agree. I call them inconvenient truths, right? And sometimes it's better just to say plausible deniability. I didn't know. I don't know how you can not know today, right? It's just that important. Sara, Lindsey, Jim, what a great conversation. Thank you so much for your insight, your perspectives. Each one of you brings a slightly different perspective. It's an important conversation that I hope many, many people will listen to. I know my students will. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.